Before we begin tonight's story, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you was deliberately erased from history. The men who controlled the newspapers, the courts, and the record books made sure of it. But in the colored quarters of Mississippi, in the back rooms of freedmen's churches, and in the hidden spaces where black folks gathered away from white eyes, this story survived. Passed down in whispers for generations. Tonight, it finally gets told. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is dedicated to uncovering the stories that powerful people wanted buried. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I want to know how far these forgotten histories are traveling. The story begins in the spring of 1871 in Yazoo County, Mississippi, a place where Reconstruction was supposed to bring freedom, but instead brought a different kind of terror. The war had ended 6 years earlier, but in Yazoo County, white men who'd lost everything were determined to take back what they considered theirs through fear and violence. They called themselves the Knights of the White Rose, the most ruthless chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi. 13 men formed the inner circle, meeting every Thursday night in the back room of the Yazoo City Hotel. These weren't poor white trash or ignorant farmers. They were lawyers, plantation owners, businessmen, and the county judge. Men with power who used that power like a noose. In March 1871, they burned down the Freeman School, a one-room schoolhouse where colored children learned to read. The teacher, a young black woman named Sarah Mitchell, died in the fire, along with 3 students who couldn't escape. The Knights said it was an accident. Everyone knew better. In April, they dragged a black Union veteran named James Cooper from his home and hanged him from an oak tree for the crime of registering to vote. They left his body swinging for 3 days as a warning. No one was arrested, no investigation was opened. In May, they raided a church meeting where freedmen were organizing to petition the federal government for protection. They beat 12 people senseless, shot 2 dead, and burned the church to the ground. The local newspaper called it a justifiable response to Negro agitation. The message was clear: freedom was a lie, and any black person who believed otherwise would pay in blood. Into this hell walked a woman who called herself Rose Dubois. She arrived in Yazoo City on a Tuesday morning in late May, stepping off the steamboat from Vicksburg, wearing a dress that was too fine for a colored woman, and carrying herself with a dignity that made white folks uncomfortable. She was beautiful, with skin the color of mahogany, high cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She looked to be about 25, though something about her suggested she'd lived far more than her years. She spoke perfect French and English, with a cultured accent that suggested education far beyond what any local black person could access. She told people she was Creole from New Orleans, the widow of a French merchant, and that she'd come to Yazoo County to visit distant relatives and perhaps buy property. The story was plausible enough. New Orleans had a sophisticated Creole society where light-skinned black folks could sometimes pass between worlds. Wealthy Creole widows did occasionally travel, and Yazoo County, for all its violence, was still trying to attract investment and settlement. Rose rented a small house on the edge of the colored quarter, close enough to the community to be acceptable, but refined enough to suggest means. She attended the AME church every Sunday, sitting in the back and speaking to no one. She hired a local girl as a maid. She kept to herself, reading French novels on her porch and tending a small garden. But Rose Dubois wasn't who she claimed to be, and she hadn't come to Yazoo County to buy property. She'd come to kill 13 men. The truth, which would only be whispered years later, was that Rose had been born Rosetta Freeman in Yazoo County. She was the daughter of freedmen who'd worked a small plot of land, saved their money, and dared to dream of a better future. Her father, Marcus, had been a skilled carpenter. Her mother, Ida, had been a seamstress who made beautiful quilts that white ladies bought without knowing a black woman's hands had created them. In 1869, when Rosetta was 15, the Knights of the White Rose decided the Freeman family was getting too prosperous, too independent, too uppity. They came in the night, burned the house, and killed both her parents. They did worse to her mother before they killed her, things that Rosetta heard from her hiding place in the root cellar. They thought the girl had died in the fire, but Rosetta had escaped, crawling through the darkness to the home of a French-speaking Creole family who secretly helped runaways. They sent her north to Philadelphia, where she was taken in by a wealthy black family with connections to the Underground Railroad network that had never really disbanded. For 2 years, Rosetta learned. She learned to read and write. She learned French and how to move in society. She learned which plants could heal and which could kill. She learned where the jugular vein was and exactly how deep a knife needed to go. And she learned the names of every man who'd been in that mob, every man who'd laughed while her mother screamed. By the spring of 1871, Rosetta Freeman had become Rose Dubois, and she'd come home to settle accounts. She spent her first month in Yazoo City, observing, listening, and learning. She learned that the 13 Knights met every Thursday at the hotel. She learned their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. She learned which ones drank too much, which ones visited the coloured brothels on the edge of town, which ones had secrets they'd kill to protect. And slowly, carefully, she began to make contact. The first man she approached was William Hendricks, a cotton merchant who'd fallen on hard times since the war. He'd been part of the mob that killed her parents, though not one of the leaders. Rose accidentally encountered him at the general store, dropped her parcels, and accepted his help with gracious gratitude that made him feel like a gentleman instead of a monster. Over the next 2 weeks, she engineered 3 more chance encounters. Each time she was charming, grateful, and just vulnerable enough to make him feel protective. When he finally asked if he could call on her, she demurely agreed, saying that a widow far from home appreciated kind company. He came to her house on a Thursday evening, June 15th, after the Knights' meeting. She served him French wine, laced with enough laudanum to make him relaxed and trusting. They talked. She laughed at his stories. She touched his hand and told him how lonely she'd been. When he leaned in to kiss her, she let him. And when he closed his eyes, lost in the moment, she drew the razor-sharp knife from where it was hidden in her skirts and opened his throat with surgical precision. William Hendricks died without making a sound, slumping forward into her arms. She held him for a moment, feeling nothing, then carefully lowered his body to the floor. On his chest, she placed a card written in careful script for Marcus and Ida Freeman. Remember their names. She wrapped the body in canvas, loaded it onto a cart in the dead of night, and left it in front of the Yazoo City Hotel, where the Knights met. By the time anyone found it at dawn, Rose was in church, praying with the other coloured folks, her face a mask of piety. The white community was shocked. The coloured community was silent. And in the back rooms and quiet corners, people began to whisper about a ghost, a spirit of vengeance, a woman who'd come back from the dead to claim what was owed. They started calling her the Midnight Rose. The Knights held an emergency meeting. They increased their patrols, warned each other to be careful, and began investigating. But they were looking for a man, someone angry and violent. They never considered that the elegant Creole widow who attended church and read French novels might be the killer. 3 weeks later, Thomas Braddock died. He was a lawyer who defended Klan members in court and made sure no white man was ever convicted of crimes against coloured folks. Rose had seduced him the same way, invited him to her home, and killed him with the same cold efficiency. This time, the card read, "For Sarah Mitchell and the children who burned, justice comes." Now the Knights couldn't deny the pattern. 2 of their members, both killed the same way, both left with messages that referenced specific crimes. The remaining 11 men were terrified. They hired guards, they changed their routines, they stopped going anywhere alone. But Rose was patient. She'd waited 2 years for this moment. She could wait a few more weeks to find the right opening. Her third victim was Henry Sutton, the plantation owner who'd led the mob that killed James Cooper. Rose learned that Sutton visited a colored woman named Clara who lived on the edge of his property, a woman he kept as a mistress while his white wife stayed in the big house. Rose approached Clara in secret, told her who she was and what she was doing. Clara had her own reasons to hate Sutton. She agreed to help. When Sutton came for his usual Thursday night visit, Clara had drugged his whiskey. Rose was waiting in the shadows. The card on his body read, "For James Cooper. For every man you lynched, hell is waiting." 3 dead, 10 to go, and the Knights were starting to panic. They held a meeting at the hotel. All 11 of them crowded into the back room, with armed guards at every door. They'd figured out that someone was targeting them specifically. Someone who knew their crimes, someone who was methodical and patient. Judge William Morrison, the leader of the Knights, had done some investigating. He'd looked into Rose Dubois and found the same thing the others had missed. There was no record of her in New Orleans, no Creole family named Dubois, no French merchant husband who'd died. The whole identity was a fiction. But digging deeper, Morrison found something that made his blood run cold. The Freeman family had owned property on Old Mill Road. They'd had a daughter, about 15 at the time they died. The girl was presumed dead in the fire, but no body had ever been found. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, his voice shaking despite his attempt at control, "we're being hunted by a ghost, by the Freeman girl. She's come back, and she won't stop until we're all dead." The room erupted in arguments. Some wanted to arrest Rose immediately. Others wanted to kill her quietly. A few suggested they flee the county entirely. But what they didn't know was that Rose had anticipated this moment. She'd cultivated relationships with every coloured person who worked at the hotel, the maids and cooks and porters who were invisible to white folks. And one of those maids, a young woman named Letty, was in the hallway outside their meeting room, listening to every word. By morning, Rose knew everything they'd said. She knew they'd figured out who she was. She knew they were planning to come for her, and she knew exactly what to do next. That night, Rose disappeared from her house. The Knights sent men to arrest her, but she was gone. They searched the coloured quarter, threatened people, offered rewards. No one knew where she was. Or rather, everyone knew, but no one was telling. The truth was that Rose had moved into the network of safe houses that the freedmen's community had maintained since slavery days. She moved from home to home, from church basement to root cellar, always one step ahead of the Knights' searches. And from those hiding places, she continued her work. Over the next 2 months, 4 more Knights died. Each death was different. One was stabbed in an alley, another was poisoned at a restaurant, a third was shot from a distance while riding his horse. The fourth simply disappeared, his body found weeks later in the swamp. Each corpse bore a card, each card named a victim, each death sent a clear message. There was no safety, no escape, no place the Knights could hide where justice wouldn't find them. By September, only 6 Knights remained. They'd fortified themselves in Morrison's plantation house, surrounded by armed guards, refusing to leave for any reason. They sent for federal troops, claiming they were under attack from a Negro uprising. But when the troops arrived, they found no uprising, just a terrified group of white men hiding from a single black woman who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The federal commander, a Union veteran named Captain Harrison, interviewed people throughout the county. What he learned troubled him deeply. These weren't random killings. Each victim had been part of the Knights. Each had participated in documented atrocities against freedmen. The Negro uprising was actually one woman seeking revenge for crimes that local authorities had refused to prosecute. Captain Harrison was faced with an impossible choice. He could hunt down Rose and arrest her, making her a martyr and likely triggering the actual uprising the Knights feared. Or he could do nothing and let nature take its course. He chose a middle path. He told the Knights that federal troops couldn't stay indefinitely. He suggested they might want to consider leaving Mississippi, perhaps moving west where no one knew their names or their crimes. And he quietly let it be known in the coloured community that he'd be withdrawing his troops in 2 weeks. 3 of the knights took his advice. They sold their property at a loss and fled, 1 to Texas, 1 to California, 1 all the way to Oregon. Better to be broken alive than wealthy and dead. But Judge Morrison and the 2 others refused to leave. This was their land, their county, their world. They wouldn't be driven out by a coloured woman, no matter how dangerous she was. That decision would cost them everything. On the night of October 31st, 1871, fire broke out at Morrison's plantation house. The guards ran to fight the flames, leaving the main house vulnerable. In the chaos and smoke, Rose entered through a window she'd left unlatched earlier when she'd posed as a maid seeking work. She found the 3 men huddled in Morrison's study, armed and waiting, but they were waiting for an army, not a single woman who moved like smoke through the burning house. What happened next was never fully documented. The official story said the men died in the fire, overcome by smoke, but the coloured folks who helped retrieve the bodies knew better. Each man had his throat cut, each bore a card, and on the wall written in blood was a final message. For every life you stole, for every dream you murdered, for my mother and father, justice. Rose Dubois vanished that night. Some said she went to Canada. Others claimed she stayed in the South, moving from town to town, continuing her work wherever the Klan operated. A few insisted she died in the fire, a sacrifice necessary to complete her mission. The truth was simpler and harder. Rose went north, back to Philadelphia, and lived quietly for the next 30 years under yet another name. She never married, never spoke of what she'd done, and died in 1901, taking her full story to the grave. But in Yazoo County, in the coloured churches, and in the stories passed down through generations, the Midnight Rose lived on. She became a legend, a symbol, proof that even in the darkest times, justice could find a way, that the powerless weren't always helpless, that there were consequences for evil, even when the law looked away. 13 men died in 1871. Their crimes were remembered, their victims were honoured, and their deaths marked the beginning of the end for the Knights of the White Rose in Mississippi. Somewhere in the shadows of history, a girl who lost everything found something close to peace, not perfect, not clean, but real. What do you think? Could something like this have happened? In a time when black lives meant nothing to the law, when the Klan operated with impunity, when justice was only available to white folks? Could one woman with courage and determination have changed the course of history? These stories matter. These voices deserve to be heard. And together, we can make sure they're never forgotten again.